Okay, this is my video for this week's reading about the death of the procedural safeguards. I'm going to start off by talking about what the prior restraint is. Prior restraint is the censorship imposed that forbids certain speech or expressions. Most of the time it's considered unconditional to most people. I'm one of those people. In the article, it talks about, or it stated that most prior restraints are now constitutional and that it may be affected unless and until the speech is carried out in court and it is protected. I believe that that's so because, or that it's constitutional now because of the procedural safeguards. It also goes on into the article to state that talk about that the federal courts destroyed the procedural safeguards that required the prior restraints that were founded by the Friedman versus Maryland case. The Supreme Court says the dangers of the prior restraint were considered neutrality. But since the 2002 reveals that the procedural safeguards may threaten the speech interests, goes on into the article, this part I found interesting, that the first procedural safeguards have not been required even for the content-based prior restraints in some cases. And then the second part, it said that the courts of appeals have held that in the context of content-neutral prior restraints, the First Amendment no longer requires a time limit on the initial administrative censor's decision about whether to allow speech. This part was kind of key to the due process, and without it, it allows the government to restrain speech that it doesn't want while keeping the content neutrality. Prior restraint, to me, is never justified. In this country, the First Amendment, it guarantees our freedom of speech, freedom of expression, etc. Prior restraint is a violation of a person's First Amendment's rights, as we all know, and it's almost never justified. Okay, maybe like publishing a government's material and such is an exception to being justified, but in this case, not so much. We're not necessarily talking about. Prior restraint is normally used to prevent people from, hearing one side of a person's problem and taking the opposite person's side. I mean, say, I want to listen to your side of the story, but I'm not going to take your side. I'm going to take the other person's side just because. That reason is not justified. But this prior restraint is violated by the First Amendment. And there's a reason that it is violated by the First Amendment, I believe. And then it goes on into the article. It states that the scholars have found that the content neutrality threatens to become the dominating principle of free speech. And it says the requirement stems from the idea that the First Amendment speech and press clause is to prevent the government from regulating speech based on the particular message. Prior restraint is considered one of the worst forms of censorship because of how it works. I kind of think that we can all relate to that and agree to it. Prior restraint is often ordered in court, but a person who speaks in violation of one without challenging it, they can't challenge it later, no matter if it's constitutional or constitutional, their speech. I mean, it doesn't matter either way. I mean, if a person, if you speak in that violation, it doesn't matter whether you want to challenge it or not. I mean, it's pretty much done for. That's about all I've got for this week's reading. Hope y'all have enjoyed. Thanks.